She traveled 800 miles to marry a man she'd never met. He took one look at her and rejected her in front of the entire town. No money to go back, no family to return to, no one in that crowd willing to speak a single word in her defense. Just the dust of a Kansas street, the weight of a travel bag, and 32 years of a life that had never once been easy. Most women would have wept. Most women would have begged. Most women would have climbed back onto that stagecoach and disappeared. Evelyn Ashcroft was not most women. Instead of running, she lifted her chin, picked up her bag, and walked. Not away from Redstone Crossing, but deeper into it. Straight toward the one door that was still open. Straight toward the life no one believed she could build. What happened next would shake an entire frontier town to its foundation. Because the woman they discarded on that boardwalk, she was about to become the most dangerous person Harold Whitmore had ever underestimated. This is her story. If this is the kind of story that keeps you up at night, hit like, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments, and stay until the very last word. You won't want to miss what comes next. The stagecoach rattled to a stop with a groan of timber and the shriek of iron wheels dragging against dry earth, and for a long moment, nobody moved. Inside the cramped carriage, Evelyn Ashcroft sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her spine straight despite 11 days of being thrown against hard wooden seats, her dark traveling dress creased and dusty from a journey that had carried her across more emptiness than she had ever imagined the world could hold. She had watched the Kansas frontier unspool through the window like a fever dream, flat, bone-dry, relentless, and she had told herself every single morning that it didn't matter, that what waited at the end was worth every bruised mile. She pressed one gloved hand against the window glass now and looked out at Redstone Crossing for the first time. It was smaller than she'd expected. A single main street of rutted brown dirt, flanked by a row of buildings so sun-bleached they had lost all memory of their original color. A general store, a feed merchant, a saloon with a broken shutter hanging at an angle, a few horses tied to posts, tails flicking at flies, and people, maybe 24 of them, gathered along the boardwalk with the specific, unhurried attention of people who had been waiting for something to entertain them. They were waiting for her. Evelyn drew a slow breath, checked that the single pin holding her hair was still in place, and reached for the door latch. The driver, a weathered man named Cobb, who had barely spoken 10 words in 3 days, pulled the door open from the outside and squinted at her with something that might have been pity if his face had been capable of softer expressions. "End of the line, ma'am," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Cobb." She stepped down onto the Kansas earth and felt it solid beneath her boots, firmer than she'd expected, as though the ground itself was testing whether she was worth holding up. The crowd on the boardwalk shifted. She could feel their eyes moving over her the way hands might move over livestock at a fair, measuring, calculating, finding fault before a word had been spoken. She was 32 years old, dark-haired, with steady gray eyes, and a face that wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped men in their tracks but was, she had always believed, an honest face. A face that had worked, that had survived. She smoothed the front of her dress and looked for the man she had come to marry. He wasn't hard to find. Harold Whitmore stood at the far end of the boardwalk as though he had arranged himself specifically to be looked at. A broad man somewhere in his mid-50s with a belly that strained against his waistcoat and a gold watch chain glinting against the fabric. His hair was silver and carefully oiled. His boots were the most expensive things in view. He held himself with the particular confidence of a man who had spent decades buying whatever he needed and had never once been told no. He was already frowning. Evelyn walked toward him with her chin level and her hands still. She had practiced stillness the way some women practice needlework, deliberately and with great effort over many years. And she stopped 3 feet from him and met his eyes. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'm Evelyn Ashcroft. I believe you've been expecting me." Harold Whitmore looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at a purchase he suspects he's been cheated on, with slow, calculating displeasure. His eyes moved from her face to her dress, to her boots, to her travel-worn bag, and then back to her face. Something hardened in his expression. "You're older than your photograph," he said. The boardwalk went very quiet. Evelyn kept her voice measured. "That photograph was taken some years ago. And shorter. He said it flatly, as though reading from a list. The letter described you as tall. The letter described me as capable and hardworking, Mr. Whitmore, which I am. I described what I wanted, he said, his voice rising just slightly. Enough for the nearest onlookers to hear clearly, and they wanted to hear clearly. Evelyn could see it in the way they had stopped pretending to do anything else. I was specific in my requirements. I paid the full agency fee in advance. I arranged this. He gestured vaguely at the space between them as though their entire arrangement was an object that had disappointed him. At considerable expense and considerable inconvenience, and what they've sent me is a woman, Evelyn said quietly. He blinked. What they've sent you, she continued, keeping her voice perfectly level, is a woman, a capable, educated, hard-working woman who traveled 800 miles on your invitation and your word. I'd ask you to remember that before you finish that sentence, Mr. Whitmore. For just a moment, one brief flickering moment, something uncertain crossed Harold Whitmore's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold confidence of a man who was accustomed to winning. I don't want her, he said, loudly, deliberately, to the crowd as much as to her. Send her back where she came from. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. She felt the ripples move through the gathered crowd, heard the soft exhale of shock, the murmur that wasn't quite sympathy, but wasn't quite cruelty either, the sound of people watching something difficult happen to someone else and being grateful, in their quiet, shameful way, that it wasn't happening to them. Evelyn did not move. She stood perfectly still and let the words settle around her like dust, and she breathed through it. The humiliation, the anger, the cold wave of fear that washed beneath both of those things, and she did not allow any of it to reach her face. She had learned this too, in the hard years before Kansas. How to stand inside a terrible moment without letting it swallow her whole. Very well, she said at last. She turned. She picked up her bag from where Cobb had set it at the edge of the boardwalk. She walked, not hurried, not slow, to the far end of the street, where a low wooden bench sat beneath the narrow overhang of what appeared to be a closed surveyor's office. And she sat down, and she put her bag between her feet, and she looked out at Redstone Crossing with her hands folded in her lap. And she thought. She had $11.40. She had a change of clothes, a leather-bound journal, a small collection of recipes she'd written out in careful script over the years, and a thimble that had belonged to her mother. She had the return stage fare back to St. Louis if she was willing to spend every cent she had. And if she spent every cent she had, she'd arrive in St. Louis with nothing, which was almost exactly what she'd left with. The difference was that she'd left St. Louis with a destination. She no longer had that. Around her, Redstone Crossing resumed the business of its afternoon. Boots on boards, the distant clang of the blacksmith, a child's laughter from somewhere behind the mercantile, the smell of horse and sawdust, and something faintly sweet that might have been a bakery. The crowd that had gathered to watch her humiliation dispersed in ones and twos, each of them carrying the story home like a souvenir. One woman lingered. She was perhaps 60, with white hair pinned beneath a practical bonnet, and she approached the bench with the direct, unhurried gait of someone who had long since stopped worrying about what people thought of her. She sat down beside Evelyn without invitation and looked out at the street for a moment before speaking. That was Harold Whitmore at his finest, she said dryly. Don't take it personally, dear. He once sent back a prize bull because it looked at him wrong. Evelyn glanced at her sideways. Did the bull survive? Thrived, eventually. Ended up on the Harker spread, fat and contented. The woman extended a hand. Ruth Calloway. I run the post office. Evelyn Ashcroft. She shook the offered hand. I'm not sure what I run yet. Ruth Calloway studied her with sharp, assessing eyes. You're not crying. Not yet. She seemed to find this acceptable. You have people here? No. Money? Some. Enough to get back east? Evelyn looked at the street. Enough to get back to nothing, she said. Which is what I came from, so the mathematics aren't particularly encouraging. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, There's the Boone Ranch, about 4 miles east. Silas Boone, widower, runs cattle. Got his father living out there with him. Old man hasn't been right in his head since his wife passed. Place has been going to ruin. Silas is a decent man, but he's got more troubles than he's got hours in the day. He put a notice up in my window 3 weeks ago looking for a housekeeper." She paused. "Couldn't find anyone willing to go all the way out there." "Why not?" Ruth pursed her lips. "It's a hard post, remote. The father can be difficult. Silas isn't what you'd call warm." "I didn't come to Kansas for warm," Evelyn said. Something shifted in Ruth Calloway's expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which she smoothed against her knee and handed over. Evelyn read it. The handwriting was plain and functional, devoid of flourish. Housekeeper needed, ranch work, room and board plus $5 monthly. Inquire at Boone Ranch, East Road, 4 miles. Ask for Silas Boone. "You just happened to have this in your pocket," Evelyn said. "I took it out of the window this morning," Ruth said. "Nobody was taking it. I was going to throw it away." She paused. "I'm glad I didn't." Evelyn folded the paper carefully and put it in her dress pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "Miss," Ruth corrected, "never found the right circumstances." She stood, brushed the back of her skirt, and looked down at Evelyn with something that might, in a kinder world, have been the beginning of a friendship. "The East Road starts where the blacksmith's ends. You can't miss it." She turned to go, then stopped. "One thing." "Yes?" "Don't let Silas Boone's face put you off. He looks at the world like it owes him a debt he knows he'll never collect. Doesn't mean he's wrong about everything." She walked away before Evelyn could respond. The East Road was exactly what Ruth Calloway had not promised it would be. A pale dirt track that wound between stands of dry grass and scattered cottonwood, flat and featureless as far as Evelyn could see, with the afternoon sun pressing down on everything like a hand trying to hold the world in place. She walked it with her bag over one shoulder and the folded notice in her pocket and the $11 still in her purse. And she counted her steps because counting was something to do, and doing was always better than thinking in moments like these. She thought anyway. She thought about the agency in St. Louis that had taken her fee and matched her name to Harold Whitmore's requirements. Prosperous merchant, established position, seeks capable wife of Christian character and domestic ability. And she thought about the 3 letters she and Whitmore had exchanged over the course of 6 months, letters that had been businesslike and careful and revealed almost nothing about either of them except their willingness to be businesslike and careful. She thought about the morning she had packed this bag in the cramped boarding house room she'd lived in for 4 years and told herself that this was the right thing, the practical thing, that a woman alone at 32 with no family and dwindling options did what made sense, not what made her heart lift. She had not expected her heart to lift. She had expected Kansas. Kansas was, at least in this particular respect, delivering exactly what she'd anticipated. The Boone Ranch announced itself before she could see it. She smelled it first, the sharp, warm scent of cattle on dry grass, and then heard it, the distant low complaint of animals and the intermittent clang of something metal against something else metal. Then the house itself appeared around a gentle bend in the road, a long, low structure of weathered timber that might once have been painted white but had long since been reduced to the gray of old bone. A fence ran crookedly around the yard. A water pump stood near the porch, and beside it a rusted bucket. A barn hulked at the back of the property, with one door hanging open at an angle. The whole place had the look of something that had tried very hard for a long time and was running low on effort. She pushed open the gate. It moved reluctantly, one hinge stiff with rust, and walked to the front door and knocked. Nothing happened. She knocked again, louder. A long silence. Then footsteps, heavy and irregular, and the door swung open. Silas Boone was tall, taller than she'd have guessed, with the spare, angular build of a man who hadn't eaten enough for a long time, broad shoulders carrying the particular tension of someone who had been working hard and sleeping badly for longer than was sustainable. He was perhaps 37 or 38, with dark hair that needed cutting and jaw that needed shaving and eyes of such a pale, washed-out blue that they seemed almost colorless in the afternoon light. He wore work clothes that had seen better days and boots that had seen worse. He held a wrench in one hand. He looked at her without expression. "Whatever you're selling," he said, "I can't afford it." "I'm not selling anything," Evelyn said. "I'm applying for the position." She produced the notice and held it up. "Housekeeper." Ruth Calloway gave me this. He looked at the notice. He looked at her. His expression, if anything, became slightly more closed. That posting's been up 3 weeks, he said. Nobody took it. I'm taking it now. It's 4 miles from town. I walked it. He looked at her bag, then at her boots, then at her face with those pale, unreadable eyes. You're the woman Whitmore turned away, he said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn felt the heat rise briefly in her face. Word travels, she said. This is a small town. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. I'm not looking for a charity case. The heat became something steadier and colder. I'm not looking for charity, she said. I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, manage a household, keep accounts, and care for an elderly person. I came 800 miles and I'm still standing. I don't consider that the resume of someone who needs to be pitied. She held his gaze. Now, do you need a housekeeper or not? The silence stretched. Behind Silas, somewhere deeper in the house, came a sound, low and plaintive, the kind of sound an old man makes when he's forgotten what he was trying to say. Silas's jaw tightened. He looked back over his shoulder at whatever was behind him, then back at Evelyn. Something changed in his face. Not warmth. Warmth was clearly not among the things Silas Boone kept close at hand. But something shifted. A calculation. A concession. $5 a month, he said. Room off the kitchen. You cook, clean, and look after my father when I'm on the range. He paused, choosing words with visible effort. He has difficult days. I understand. You don't. Not yet. He straightened and moved back from the door, holding it open. Come in then. Kitchen's a disaster. Might as well start with that. Evelyn stepped across the threshold of the Boone Ranch. The kitchen was, as advertised, a disaster. Pots encrusted with the remnants of meals that had been badly made and worse cleaned, a table sticky with spilled things, a floor that hadn't been swept in what appeared to be weeks, a window so grimy it let in light the way a closed eye lets in dreams. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and took a long, even breath. How long has it been since anyone kept house here? She asked. My wife passed 14 months ago, Silas said from the doorway. He said it flat and factual, the way a man says something he has learned to say without letting himself feel it. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. He nodded once. Stove works. Well pumps in the yard, firewood stacked on the south side. Pa's room is down the hall. The blue door. He'll probably be asleep. He turned to go. Mr. Boone? He stopped. I'll need a clean apron and a rag for the window if you have them. And whatever you have in the larder, I'd like to know what I'm working with. He looked at her for a moment. Larder's in the back room. There's an apron on the hook by the stove. I don't know if there are rags. He considered. Check the trunk in the washroom. Thank you. He left. She stood alone in the ruined kitchen in the middle of the Kansas frontier and did the only thing that had ever made sense to her when the world fell apart. She rolled up her sleeves and started to work. She was still working 2 hours later when she heard it, a sound from the hallway, soft and shuffling, the sound of careful old feet on uneven floorboards. She turned from the stove where a pot of beans had been soaking and a pan of cornbread was warming, and found Nathan Boone in the kitchen doorway. He was small. She hadn't expected that. Silas was tall, and she'd pictured a large man, but Nathan Boone had shrunk into himself with age and grief the way old houses settle, slowly and irrevocably until they are something smaller than their original shape. He was perhaps 70, with white hair that stood up in the back and eyes of the same washed-out blue as his son's. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned wrong. He looked at her with the uncertain expression of a man who knows something has changed but can't quite locate what. Margaret? He said. Evelyn's chest ached quietly. No, she said gently. My name is Evelyn. I'm going to be keeping house for a while. She nodded toward the kitchen table. Would you like to sit? I've got beans on and cornbread nearly done. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying her with those pale eyes. And then, slowly, like a man remembering the steps to something he used to know by heart, he crossed the kitchen floor and sat down at the table. She set a bowl in front of him. She sat across from him and folded her hands and waited, the way she'd learned to wait with people who needed a moment before they could speak. He ate 3 spoonfuls. Then he looked up. You cook like you mean it, he said. His voice was rough with disuse, but clear. Evelyn looked at him across the scarred kitchen table of the Boone Ranch, and for the first time in 11 days, she felt something loosen in her chest. "I do," she said. "I always have." The sun went down outside the grime-cleared window, painting the Kansas sky in long stripes of gold and copper, and from somewhere further down the hall came the sound of boots. Silas, coming in from the evening round. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and went very still. His father was sitting at the table, talking. Silas Boone looked at the old man and then at Evelyn, and something moved across that closed, unreadable face of his. Something he clearly hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. "He hasn't sat at that table in 4 months," he said quietly. "I know," Evelyn said. "He told me." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed to the wash basin, rolled up his sleeves, and washed his hands without another word. He pulled out the chair across from his father and sat down. He looked at the bowl of beans in front of him. Then he picked up his spoon. It wasn't forgiveness or trust or welcome. It was a bowl of beans at the end of a hard day in a kitchen that had been dark for too long. But it was a beginning. That night, lying on the narrow cot in the room off the kitchen, clean sheets she'd found folded in the bottom of the cedar chest, pulled tight the way her mother had taught her. Evelyn listened to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, the low conversation of cattle in the distance, the creak of the house contracting in the night air, the wind across the Kansas grass, low and constant and ancient. She reached into her travel bag in the dark and felt for the small leather journal she always kept there, opened it to a blank page. She wrote, "Day 1. I have a kitchen, a cot, a difficult employer, an old man who is starting to remember how to talk, and $11 I didn't have to spend." She paused. Then she wrote, "This will do." She closed the journal and lay in the dark and did not think about Harold Whitmore's voice carrying across the boardwalk, or the silent faces of the crowd, or the way the air had felt after those words, "I don't want her," had landed and couldn't be taken back. She did not allow herself to feel any of that. She would feel it later, probably. In smaller pieces, when she could afford to. For now, she had work in the morning and a house that needed her, and that was enough. Beneath the sound of the wind, barely audible, she heard Nathan Boone down the hall turn in his sleep and say one word, low and clear, "Home." Evelyn Ashcroft closed her eyes. Outside, the Kansas night stretched on in every direction, vast and dark and indifferent. But inside the walls of the Boone Ranch, something small and stubborn had taken root. And stubborn things, she had always found, were the hardest things in the world to kill. The first week passed the way hard work always passes. Not quickly, not slowly, but completely, consuming every available hour until the hours themselves ceased to feel like time and became instead a rhythm, a pattern, a thing the body learned and then did without being asked. Evelyn rose before dawn each morning, before the sky had decided what color it intended to be. And she lit the stove and started the coffee and made a full breakfast that filled the kitchen with warmth and smell while the ranch was still dark and cold and silent around her. She had learned within the first 3 days what Silas Boone would eat without comment: eggs, salt pork, cornbread, black coffee, and what he would leave untouched without explanation. She did not take it personally. She simply stopped making what he left and made more of what he finished, because she was practical that way, and because winning small battles quietly was something she had always been better at than winning large ones loudly. Nathan was a different matter entirely, and a more rewarding one. The old man emerged from his room each morning with the tentative, hopeful expression of someone who had survived a long night and was relieved to find the world still in place. He would stand in the kitchen doorway and breathe in the smell of coffee and whatever Evelyn had on the stove, and something in him would relax in a visible, almost physical way, like a fist slowly opening. By the end of the first week, he was sitting at the table before she'd finished cooking, watching her work with quiet attention. "My wife made biscuits on Fridays," he said one morning, out of nowhere, in that rough-edged voice that was slowly finding its strength. "Not like yours, flatter. She rolled them too thin." Evelyn turned from the stove. "Did you tell her that?" Nathan looked genuinely horrified at the suggestion. "Lord, no. I told her they were the best biscuits in Kansas." Smart man. Survived 38 years of marriage. He picked up his coffee mug with both hands, the way old men do when their hands aren't entirely reliable. "That's not luck. That's strategy." She laughed. A real laugh. Not a polite one. And Nathan Boone looked pleased with himself in the way of a man who had just remembered he used to be funny. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway at the sound of it, already dressed for the range, and stopped when he saw his father's expression. He stood there a moment with his hat in his hand and something careful and almost painful in his eyes, watching the old man drink his coffee and smile at the ceiling, and then he put his hat on and went outside without a word. But Evelyn noticed that when he came in that evening, he sat with his father for an hour before supper, and they talked. Not about anything important, just cattle and weather and a fence post that needed replacing. But they talked, and Nathan's voice didn't fade the way it sometimes did in the afternoons, trailing off mid-sentence into silence as though he'd lost the thread of himself. She did not comment on any of this. She simply fed them both, kept the house, and waited. The house itself responded to attention the way neglected things always do, gratefully and all at once, as though it had been holding its breath. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until the original wood grain reappeared, pale and warm beneath the grime. She repaired the torn curtain in Nathan's room with thread she found in the sewing box on the parlor shelf. She organized the larder and made an inventory of what they needed and wrote it on a piece of paper in her neat, careful hand and left it on the table for Silas without comment. The next morning it was gone, and 2 days later he came back from town with everything on the list, plus a small bag of sugar she hadn't asked for, which she chose to interpret as an apology for something he hadn't said. It was on the 8th day that she found the letter. She had been reorganizing the room she slept in, the small space off the kitchen that had clearly served as a storage room before it served as her bedroom, moving a wooden crate from the corner to make room for a proper chair she'd found in the barn. The crate was heavier than it looked. When she shifted it, it scraped across the uneven floor, and the bottom corner caught on a loose board, and the whole thing tilted and spilled its contents across the floor. Old newspapers, a leather belt missing its buckle, 3 empty glass bottles, and a battered leather satchel that had been wedged beneath everything else. She almost didn't open it. She picked it up, meaning to set it aside with the other debris, and then she noticed that it had her name on it. Not written, but stamped, in the particular way of an agency document, the faded ink of the St. Louis Correspondence Bureau pressed into the leather flap. She recognized it immediately. It was the travel satchel the agency had given her when she left, the one she'd used during the journey and then set aside on her first night at the ranch, too exhausted to unpack it properly. She had not set it in this corner. She had not put it under this crate. She sat down slowly on the edge of her cot and opened the satchel. Most of what was inside was hers, the usual papers, the agency contract, the correspondence record. But tucked behind her own documents, folded in half and creased as though someone had read it many times, was a letter she had never seen before. The handwriting on the outside was familiar in the way of things you recognize before you understand why. Angular, slightly cramped, the capital letters oversized in that particular way that had always irritated her more than she'd admitted. Her brother's handwriting. Her brother, Thomas Ashcroft, who had helped her find the agency, who had encouraged her to apply, had sat with her while she wrote the letters, had told her this was a good opportunity, a fresh start, a chance at something better, who had walked her to the stage office in St. Louis and pressed her hand and said, "Take care of yourself, Evie," and looked, she now remembered, slightly unable to meet her eyes. She unfolded the letter with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. It was dated 6 weeks before her departure. It was addressed to Harold Whitmore. It was written in her brother's hand. She read it once quickly, without breathing. Then she read it again slowly, making herself understand each sentence before she moved to the next. Thomas Ashcroft owed Harold Whitmore $400, a debt incurred over what the letter described vaguely as a matter of business that had gone badly in the spring. He could not pay. He had, the letter explained in her brother's careful, cowardly prose, found another arrangement. He had, without her knowledge or consent, submitted her name to the correspondence agency, paid her fee from money that turned out to be Whitmore's own, advanced specifically for this purpose, and arranged for her to be matched with Whitmore as settlement for his debt. She was not a bride. She had never been a bride. She had been currency. A trade. Her brother's $400 solution to a problem he hadn't told her existed. The letter ended with a line that she read 3 times because she couldn't quite believe it was there in black ink on real paper. "I trust this arrangement will satisfy the outstanding amount in full, and that we can consider the matter closed between us. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot in the small room off the kitchen of the Boone Ranch, and she held her brother's letter in both hands, and she was quiet for a very long time. The anger came, but it came slowly. Not the hot, immediate kind that burned and passed, but the deep tectonic kind that moves through a person like a fault line shifting underground, changing the shape of everything above it without making a sound. She had known Thomas was weak. She had known he made bad decisions and poor choices and borrowed more than he could repay, and always found someone else to absorb the cost. She had spent years absorbing costs her brother couldn't meet. She had thought she understood the full dimensions of what he was capable of. She had been wrong. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her journal between two blank pages, because she was not ready to decide what to do with it yet, and because she needed it to be somewhere she could find it. Then she stood up, smoothed her dress, and went back to the kitchen and finished making supper. She did not tell Silas that night. She did not tell Nathan. She cooked, and she served, and she cleared, and she washed, and all the while she was thinking with the particular cold clarity that sometimes arrives on the other side of shock, when the emotions have run ahead and left the mind momentarily quiet and capable. She needed to understand the full shape of what Thomas had done before she decided what to do about it. She needed to know if the letter was the whole of it, or only the part she could see. It was Ruth Calloway who gave her the first thread to pull. Evelyn went into town the following week on the pretext of collecting the mail, which was true enough. There was a parcel for Nathan that Silas had forgotten about, and she stopped at the post office and found Ruth behind the counter sorting envelopes with the practiced speed of someone who had been doing the same thing for 30 years. "You're still there," Ruth said, looking up. "I wasn't certain. I'm still there," Evelyn confirmed. She set the parcel claim on the counter. "Ruth, what do you know about Harold Whitmore's business dealings?" Ruth's hands went still on the envelopes. She looked at Evelyn with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Why?" "Because I think I've found evidence that what happened to me on that boardwalk wasn't the first time he's used a woman as a financial instrument, and I'd like to know if I'm right." The silence in the post office had a particular quality, the kind that happens when someone decides how much to trust you. Ruth studied her for a long moment. Then she set the envelopes down entirely and came around the counter. "Close the door," she said quietly. Evelyn closed it. "Harold Whitmore has been running debts through this town for 15 years, Ruth said, keeping her voice low. "He loans money to families in trouble. Farms, mostly, some merchants, at terms that look reasonable on the face of it and aren't once you read the fine print, which most people can't or don't because they're desperate, and he's the only one offering." She paused. "When they can't pay, and he times it so they can't pay, he calls in what he's owed, not always in money. What does he take? Property, labor, sometimes—" Ruth pressed her lips together. "Sometimes other things. The Delaney girl 2 years ago. Married off to one of Whitmore's associates at 19 to settle her father's account. The Carver family lost their farm in the spring. They had an agreement in writing that said the land couldn't be claimed for non-payment, but Whitmore had another document that said different, and somehow the second one was the one that held in court." She paused. "He owns the judge's mortgage." Evelyn felt the cold clarity in her mind sharpen further. "Has anyone tried to challenge him legally?" "2 men. Both left town before the cases came to anything. One of them had a fire." Ruth met her eyes. "The kind of fire nobody investigates too hard. Do you have records? The families he's dealt with, do they have their documents?" "Most of them do. People hold on to papers when they feel cheated, even when they've given up on getting justice." Ruth tilted her head. "Why? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Evelyn said carefully, "that one person with one letter is a grievance, but 10 families with documented agreements, fraudulent contracts, and a pattern going back 15 years is something else entirely." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised Evelyn. Not the words themselves, but the steadiness with which they were delivered, the quiet, patient anger underneath them. "I've been waiting for someone to say those words for 4 years." The weeks that followed were the most dangerous and the most alive that Evelyn had felt since leaving St. Louis. During the days she kept the ranch, cooking, cleaning, managing the household with the same steady competence that was slowly making the Boone property recognizable as a home again. And during the evenings, when Nathan was asleep and Silas was reviewing the ranch accounts by lamplight, She sat at the kitchen table with her journal open and built what she privately thought of as the map. Ruth connected her with families, carefully, one at a time, in back rooms and on quiet afternoons. The Hendersons, who had lost a grain contract to a document they swore they'd never signed. The widow Marsh, whose late husband's debts had somehow multiplied to 3 times their original amount after his death. A young man named Cole Prentice, who had worked 2 full seasons on Whitmore's warehouse crew under a labor agreement that turned out to be legally indistinguishable from indenture. Each of them had papers. Each of them had pieces of the story. And each of them, when they looked at Evelyn sitting across from them with her journal and her careful handwriting and her steady gray eyes, said some version of the same thing. I didn't think anyone would believe me. I believe you, she said each time. Tell me everything. She cross-referenced dates. She compared document language. She found the same phrasing appearing in contracts separated by years and families and circumstances. The identical language of the same hand, the same deliberate obscurity in the clauses that mattered, the same notarization stamp from the same notary who turned out to be Whitmore's own brother-in-law. She wrote it all down, organized it, built the case the way she built a kitchen, methodically, without rushing, making sure every element was in its correct place before moving to the next. It was during this time that Silas found out. She hadn't planned to tell him. Not yet. Not until she had more. But she had left the journal open on the kitchen table one evening when she went to check on Nathan, and when she came back, Silas was sitting in her chair reading it with the focused, careful attention of a man who reads slowly and means every word. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. How long? He said. 3 weeks? He looked back at the journal page. The Hendersons are our neighbors, he said. Their east fence line runs against ours. He paused. Dale Henderson told me 2 years ago that Whitmore was pressing him. I didn't ask enough questions. You had your own troubles. That's not an excuse. He said it flat, without self-pity. He set the journal down and looked at her. What do you need? She sat down across from him. I need to find a way to get these documents in front of someone who isn't in Whitmore's pocket. The county sheriff. Whitmore hosted the sheriff's last fundraising dinner. Silas's jaw was set. But there's a federal land agent in Dodge City who's been investigating land fraud across the territory. Man named Greer. I've heard his name from decent people. Evelyn opened her journal to a fresh page. Tell me about Greer, he told her. And for the first time since she had arrived at the Boone Ranch, Silas Boone and Evelyn Ashcroft sat on the same side of the kitchen table and worked on the same problem together, the lamplight between them and the Kansas night outside and the quiet of a house that had slowly, without ceremony, become something neither of them had expected. A home, not yet easy, not yet simple, but real. Somewhere down the hall, Nathan Boone turned in his sleep and did not cry out. He was sleeping better now. Everyone was sleeping better now. And the ranch was running smoother, and the accounts were slightly less grim than they'd been the month before, and none of that happened by accident. Evelyn knew it. Silas knew it too, though he hadn't said so yet. He would. She was patient. But beneath the quiet surface of the rebuilding ranch, something else was moving. The slow, gathering weight of truth accumulating, document by document, name by name, until it was large enough to be impossible to ignore. Harold Whitmore had spent 15 years convincing an entire territory that he was untouchable. He had not, in all that time, encountered Evelyn Ashcroft. That was about to change. The letter to Agent Greer in Dodge City went out on a Tuesday, carried by Ruth Calloway herself, who handed it to the westbound stage driver with the particular gravity of a woman who understood exactly what she was setting in motion. It was 3 pages long, written in Evelyn's careful hand, and it contained enough specific dates, document references, and named witnesses to make it impossible to dismiss as the complaint of a disgruntled stranger. Ruth had added her own signature beneath Evelyn's. So had Dale Henderson, whose hand shook slightly when he held the pen, but who pressed it to the paper without hesitation. They did not tell anyone else. Not yet. The waiting was the hardest part. Harder than the gathering had been, harder than the nights Evelyn had spent at the kitchen table cross-referencing dates until her eyes ached and the lamplight blurred. During the gathering she had been moving, and movement kept the fear at a manageable distance. Waiting gave the fear room to expand. She did not let it show. She cooked and cleaned and looked after Nathan and managed the ranch accounts and sat with Silas in the evenings while he told her, in his spare and reluctant way, more about Greer, that the federal agent had successfully prosecuted 2 land fraud cases in the eastern part of the territory the previous year, that he was known to be thorough, that he was not connected to any of the local political machinery that Whitmore had spent years quietly purchasing. These were the facts Evelyn held on to in the slow hours between sending the letter and waiting for a response. Nathan, who noticed more than anyone gave him credit for, watched her one morning across the breakfast table with those pale eyes that had grown steadier and more present with each passing week. "You're carrying something heavy," he said. Evelyn looked up from her coffee. "I'm all right, Nathan." "I didn't say you weren't." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I said you were carrying something heavy. Those aren't the same thing." He paused. "Margaret used to do that. Looked like everything was fine right up until the moment it wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I found out that the man I was sent here to marry, that the arrangement was made without my knowledge or consent, by someone I trusted." Nathan was quiet for a moment that held its own particular weight. "Family?" he asked. "My brother?" He nodded slowly, unsurprised in the way of old men who have seen enough of human nature to stop being shocked by its capacities. "That's the worst kind of betrayal," he said. "The kind that comes from the direction you weren't watching." "Yes," she said, "it is." They sat with that for a while, the two of them, in the kitchen that had become the warmest room in Evelyn's world, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it. That was one of the things she had come to value about Nathan Boone. He understood that some truths didn't need to be solved, only acknowledged. The response from Agent Greer arrived 17 days after Ruth posted the letter. It was brief, official, and carried the particular weight of government language that is trying to say more than it is permitted to put in writing. He would be in Redstone Crossing within the fortnight. He asked that the named witnesses be available. He asked that all original documents be preserved. He noted in the final line that the pattern described in their letter was consistent with methods he had been investigating for some time across the territory. Evelyn read that last line twice. Then she folded the letter and sat very still for a moment. She had known Whitmore's operation extended beyond Redstone Crossing. The dates and document language she'd found made that clear enough. But to have it confirmed by a federal investigator who had been building a case from the other direction meant something she hadn't quite allowed herself to believe until now. That this was large enough to be real, and real enough to be stopped. She told Silas that evening. He read the letter standing up, still in his range clothes, and when he finished, he set it on the table and put both hands flat on either side of it and looked at the wall for a long moment. "He's going to find out someone's been asking questions," Silas said, "before Greer gets here. You understand that?" "I know. Whitmore has people everywhere in this town. The clerk at the land office. The man who runs the telegraph." He looked at her. "Maybe the deputy." "Not the deputy," she said. "I've spoken with Deputy Harlan twice now. He's careful about what he says and who he says it in front of, but he's not corrupt. He's scared. Scared men do Whitmore's work for him just as well as bought ones." "Scared men," Evelyn said, "can also be reminded that there's something worth being brave for, if they're shown it clearly enough." Silas looked at her with those pale eyes that had, over the weeks, become slightly less unreadable to her. She was learning the language of his face the way you learn a difficult terrain, slowly and with great attention. What she saw now was not doubt exactly, but the careful calculation of a man weighing risk against necessity. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "I need you to talk to the Hendersons and the Carvers and Cole Prentice. Tell them Greer is coming. Tell them they need to hold their nerve for 2 more weeks and keep their documents safe." She paused. "And I need you to be there when I go into town tomorrow." "Why tomorrow?" She looked at him steadily. "Because Whitmore's warehouse foreman came past the east fence this afternoon while you were at the south pasture. He didn't stop. He just rode past slowly and looked at the house." She let that sit for a moment. "He was counting windows." Silas's jaw set in that way she'd learned meant he was making a decision he wasn't going to talk himself out of. "I'll be ready at first light," he said. They went into town the next morning in the ranch wagon, Evelyn sitting straight-backed on the bench beside Silas, her journal and the full collection of copied documents in the flat leather case on her lap. The originals were hidden beneath a floorboard in Nathan's room, chosen because no one would think to look there, and because Nathan himself, when told what was hidden and why, had straightened in his chair and said, "Good," with a quiet satisfaction that suggested he had been waiting for something worth protecting. The town felt different, or perhaps she was different in it. She had walked these streets enough times now that they were familiar, and familiarity changes the way you move through a place, puts a steadiness in the step that wasn't there before. People noticed her differently, too. The storekeeper nodded. A woman she'd met through Ruth, whose family name was on Evelyn's list, pressed her hand briefly without words as she passed. Small signals, the kind that could mean nothing or everything depending on what was building beneath the surface. She went to the post office first because Ruth needed to know Greer's response had arrived. She found Ruth already in conversation with Deputy Harlan, a lean, weathered man in his early 40s with a careful manner and the eyes of someone who had been watching dangerous things happen for a long time without feeling licensed to stop them. He looked at Evelyn when she entered with an expression that told her he already knew more than she'd expected. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Deputy Harlan." She set the leather case on Ruth's counter and looked at him directly. "How much do you know?" He was quiet for a moment. "Enough to know that whatever you've been building, you've been careful about it." He paused. "Enough to know that Whitmore sent a man to the telegraph office yesterday evening, and that the message he sent went to someone in the county seat." Another pause, longer. "Enough to be standing here instead of at my desk." "Are you standing here because you want to help?" she said. "Or because you want to know how much trouble is coming so you can decide which side to be on before it arrives?" The silence in the post office was the sharpest thing in the room. Deputy Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face shifted, the careful, watchful neutrality dropping away to reveal something older and more tired and more honest underneath it. "My father lost his mill to Harold Whitmore 11 years ago," he said quietly. "Document dispute. Whitmore had 2 lawyers, and my father had his word." He looked at the counter. "I took this job 3 years later thinking maybe I could do something from the inside." He paused. "I've spent 8 years being too careful and not careful enough at the same time." "Then be useful now," Evelyn said. Not unkindly, but with the directness she'd stopped apologizing for. "Greer arrives in less than 2 weeks. I need the witnesses to be safe, and I need the documents to be preserved. Can you do that?" He looked at her. He looked at Ruth. He picked up his hat from Ruth's counter where he'd set it, turned it once in his hands, and put it on. "Tell me what you need," he said. They almost made it to Greer's arrival without incident. Almost. 4 days before the federal agent was due in Redstone Crossing, Evelyn came down to the kitchen in the early morning to find Silas already awake and standing at the front window with the particular stillness of a man who has seen something that requires stillness. She came to stand beside him and looked out. 3 men on horseback at the end of the ranch road, not moving, just present, in the way that a threat is present, not doing anything yet, but making sure you knew it could. "How long?" she asked. "About an hour." His voice was flat. They came before first light. She watched them for a moment. One of the men she recognized, the warehouse foreman who had ridden past the fence. The other 2 she didn't know, but knew their type, the kind of men who are paid not for particular skills, but for particular willingness. "He knows," she said. "Yes. He's trying to decide if this is enough to make me stop." Silas turned to look at her. "Is it?" She turned away from the window and went to the stove and put the kettle on. "Make sure the rifle is loaded," she said, "and then come have breakfast. I'm not going to let his men ruin my morning." She heard something move through Silas then, not quite a laugh, but the breath of one, and the tension in the kitchen changed its quality slightly. They ate breakfast with Nathan, who looked at Silas's expression, and then at the window, and then at his cornbread, and said, "Men at the fence again?" with the equanimity of someone who had seen enough of the world to know that men at fences eventually have to go home. "Yes," Silas said. "They'll get bored," Nathan said. "Men like that always do." He was right. By mid-morning, the road was empty. But Evelyn spent that afternoon writing 2 additional copies of her full summary document, the complete case, dates and names and evidence and witnesses. And she sent 1 copy to Ruth and 1 to Deputy Harlan with instructions that they were to be mailed directly to the federal land office in Topeka if anything happened to her or to the ranch. This was not fear. It was architecture, building the case with enough redundancy that no single point of pressure could collapse the whole structure. James Greer was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something large and official-looking, a man who wore his authority on the outside. What arrived on the Tuesday stage was a narrow, quiet man in his mid-50s with unremarkable clothes and a leather traveling case that he carried himself, who looked at Redstone Crossing from the boardwalk with the patient, methodical gaze of someone cataloging details. He shook Evelyn's hand with a firm, brief grip and said, "Miss Ashcroft, your letter was very well organized." He said it as though document organization was the quality he valued most in a person, which, she decided, it probably was. They spent the first evening in Ruth's back room. Evelyn, Greer, Ruth, Deputy Harlan, Silas, and the 4 families who had agreed to come forward, the Hendersons, the widow Marsh with her eldest son, Cole Prentice, and a quiet older farmer named August Webb, whose debt arrangement with Whitmore had cost him an entire winter's grain harvest 3 years running. Each of them laid their documents on Ruth's table, and Greer read each one with careful, unhurried attention, making notes in a small ledger in a handwriting so small it was almost invisible. When he finished, he closed his ledger and looked at Evelyn. "You said in your letter that you believe this pattern extended beyond Redstone Crossing," he said. "I do. The document language is identical to patterns you'd only develop if you'd use them repeatedly across multiple locations." "You'd be correct." He opened his ledger again to a particular page and showed it to her. Not the details, but the shape of it, the column of dates and place names that ran down the left margin. "I've been building this from the outside in for 2 years. You've been building it from the inside out for 2 months." He paused. "Together, I believe we have enough." The room was very quiet. Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, not yet, because relief was for after, but the particular stillness of a thing coming into alignment. "There is one complication," Greer said. "The county judge," Deputy Harlan said. "Yes. We'll need the sheriff to execute the arrest, not the deputy, which means—" "Sheriff Beaumont is independent of Whitmore," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. "Whitmore hosted his fundraising dinner, yes. But Ruth told me Beaumont refused a loan from Whitmore 3 years ago when his roof needed replacing. A man who refuses Whitmore's money refuses his ownership." She looked at Ruth. "Am I wrong?" Ruth thought for a moment. "You're not wrong. Beaumont is proud to a fault. He'd rather have a bad roof than a debt to a man he doesn't trust." "Then he can be approached," Evelyn said. Greer looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating an estimate. "Have you done this before, Miss Ashcroft?" "No," she said, "but I've had to think very carefully about who to trust for the past 2 months. And I've gotten fairly good at it." She went to Sheriff Beaumont herself. She didn't send Greer. That would feel like the law arriving to commandeer a situation it hadn't built. She didn't send Silas because Silas and Beaumont had a rancher's relationship, cordial and bounded. She went herself because the meeting needed to be exactly what it was. A woman with evidence asking a man of law to do what the law was for. Beaumont was a large man, deliberate in his movements, with a gray mustache and the permanent slight squint of someone who has spent years reading people in difficult light. He listened to her for 40 minutes without interrupting, which told her more about him than anything he could have said. She laid the copies of the documents on his desk one by one, explaining each one, connecting each one to the next, building the case the way she'd built it a dozen times over the past weeks, but this time with the certainty of someone who knows the foundation is solid. When she finished, he looked at the documents for a long time. "You understand," he said finally, "that if I move on this and it doesn't hold, Whitmore will make this town uninhabitable for everyone who was part of it." "I understand that," she said. "I also understand that if you don't move on this, it will continue to happen, to the families already on that list and to every family that comes after them. Whitmore doesn't stop voluntarily. He stops when someone makes him." Beaumont looked at her across his desk. "You've been in this town 2 months," he said. "Most people who've been here 20 years haven't done what you've done." "Most people who've been here 20 years have more to lose," she said simply. "I arrived with almost nothing. It turns out that's a certain kind of freedom." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the top document from the pile and held it at arm's length and read it one more time, slowly. "Tell Greer I want to meet him tonight," he said. She stood. He'll be at the post office after supper. Miss Ashcroft. She stopped at the door. He was looking at her with something she hadn't expected on his broad, careful face, something close to respect, though a man like Beaumont would never use that word directly. When this is done, however it goes, you can tell people the sheriff heard you. That matters to me. That you know that. She looked at him for a moment. It matters to me too, she said. She walked out of the sheriff's office and into the afternoon light of Redstone Crossing's main street, and she stood on the boardwalk for just a moment, the same boardwalk where she had stood 6 weeks ago with a traveling bag at her feet and a crowd watching her be discarded. And she breathed the dry Kansas air and felt, beneath the weight of everything still in motion, something quiet and unshakable. The next morning, Greer and Sheriff Beaumont reviewed the full case together over 3 hours. Deputy Harlan secured the witnesses. Ruth organized the families. Silas drove Nathan in from the ranch, because Nathan had said, with great firmness, that he intended to be present for whatever happened next, and no one had found a compelling argument against it. The day after that, Harold Whitmore received a formal visit from federal agent James Greer and Sheriff Beaumont together at his offices above the main street, with a deputy standing at each door. And then something happened that no one had predicted, something that split the case open from a direction no one had been watching. The door to Whitmore's private office opened, and his wife walked out. Clara Whitmore was a small, pale woman who had lived so quietly in Whitmore's shadow that most of Redstone Crossing had forgotten she existed. She was carrying a canvas bag that she held against her chest with both arms, and her face had the particular expression of someone who has been afraid for a very long time and has finally decided that fear is not the worst thing. She looked at Greer. She looked at Sheriff Beaumont. Then she looked past them both and found Evelyn standing at the back of the room. "I have letters," Clara Whitmore said. Her voice was small, but it did not shake. 15 years of letters. He kept them in a box in the floor of our bedroom because he thought I didn't know about the floor. She paused. "I've known about the floor for 12 years. She set the canvas bag on Whitmore's desk. The room was absolutely still. Evelyn looked at Clara Whitmore, at the steadiness of her hands now that they were empty, at the way she had straightened almost imperceptibly, as though setting down the bag had also set down a weight she'd been carrying for a long time. And she thought, this is what courage looks like when it's been waiting for the right moment. It doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, when the cost of staying silent finally exceeds the cost of speaking. Harold Whitmore, sitting behind his desk with 2 federal witnesses and a county sheriff between himself and the door, looked at the canvas bag and then at his wife, and for the first time in 15 years of careful calculation, he had nothing to say. The silence in that room was the loudest thing Evelyn Ashcroft had ever heard. Clara Whitmore's canvas bag contained 41 letters. Greer counted them himself, there in Harold Whitmore's office, laying each one flat on the desk with the methodical care of a man who understood that the way evidence is handled in the first moments determines what it can do in a courtroom. 41 letters spanning 14 years, written in Whitmore's own hand to associates across 3 counties. Men whose names appeared nowhere in the official documents. Men who served as the hidden machinery behind contracts that looked clean on the surface and weren't. The letters used careful language, the language of a man who knew better than to say directly what he meant. But the meaning was there if you read with the right knowledge. And Greer had that knowledge, and Evelyn had that knowledge, and together they were more than sufficient. Whitmore sat behind his desk and said nothing. His face had gone the color of old ash, and he held himself very still in the way of a man who is calculating whether there is still a move available to him, and is slowly arriving at the understanding that there is not. His lawyer, summoned by a telegram sent from the office next door before Greer had the presence of mind to stop the telegraph, arrived 40 minutes later, read 2 of the letters, and went nearly as pale as his client. Deputy Harlan stood at the door. Sheriff Beaumont stood beside the desk. Greer read through the letters in order, pausing occasionally to make a note, his face betraying nothing, and Clara Whitmore stood at the window with her back to her husband, looking out at the main street of Redstone Crossing with the expression of a woman looking at something from a very great distance. Not the buildings and the people and the afternoon light, but something beyond all of that, something that might have been the life she'd had before she'd understood what kind of man she had married and had decided, for reasons that were her own and required no explanation from anyone, to stay and wait and keep her knowledge carefully to herself until the day it could be useful. That day had come. She had not wasted it. Evelyn stood near the office door and watched Clara and felt, alongside the cold clarity of the proceeding, something quieter and more complicated. The recognition of what it costs a person to carry a secret for 12 years. The weight of that. The particular loneliness of knowing something true that you cannot yet say. When Greer finally set the last letter down, he looked at Whitmore with the neutral, professional gaze of a man who has seen this moment many times and has learned not to take satisfaction in it, because satisfaction is not the point. "Harold Whitmore," he said, "I am placing you under federal detention pending formal charges of contract fraud, unlawful debt coercion, and conspiracy to misappropriate property across multiple counties in the territory of Kansas." He paused. "Sheriff Beaumont will hold you in the county facility until the federal circuit arrives." Whitmore's lawyer started to speak. Beaumont looked at him once, and the lawyer reconsidered. Whitmore himself looked up then. For the first time since Clara had set the bag on his desk, he looked up. And the gaze he found when he looked toward the door was Evelyn's. She met it steadily. She did not look away. She did not need to say anything, and she didn't. She simply stood there with her hands quiet at her sides and let him see her clearly. The woman he had dismissed on a boardwalk 6 weeks ago. The woman he had sent horsemen to intimidate. The woman he had never once considered a serious problem. And she let him understand, in whatever way he was capable of understanding things, what he had underestimated. Then Sheriff Beaumont moved forward, and Whitmore looked away, and it was done. The days that followed moved with the particular momentum of consequence, slow at first, then faster, as each element of the case unlocked the next. Greer worked from a room above the post office that Ruth had cleared out for him, a narrow space with a table and 2 chairs that filled rapidly with documents, letters, copies, and the small ledger he carried everywhere. Evelyn came each morning and sat across from him and answered questions and helped him cross-reference dates, and he questioned her with the precise, repeating thoroughness of a man who trusted evidence more than testimony and verified everything at least twice. On the 3rd day after the arrest, a rider came from the county seat with authorization to suspend the judge's involvement in the case. Greer had moved that particular piece before he'd even arrived in Redstone Crossing. The documentation Evelyn had sent to Topeka had done its work quietly, without announcement, and the result was that the man whose mortgage Whitmore owned would have no authority over the proceedings. A federal circuit judge would preside. The timeline was 3 weeks. Cole Prentice came to find Evelyn at the post office on the 4th day, hat in hand, young face tight with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. "My labor agreement," he said. "The one that said I owed the difference if the harvest came in under a certain weight, and it always came in under that weight because Whitmore controlled the scales." He stopped. "Is that actually going to be voided? All of it?" "All fraudulent contracts will be reviewed and declared invalid," she said. "That's what Greer told me this morning. Your agreement will be among them." He was quiet for a moment. He was 23 years old and had spent 2 seasons working a debt that could never be paid by design, and he had the look of someone who had not yet allowed himself to believe that something could be taken away from Whitmore and given back. "I was going to leave," he said, "before you started asking questions. I was going to just go west and leave it." "I know," she said. "A lot of people were." "How did you know it would work, that any of it would work?" She considered the question honestly because he deserved an honest answer and not a reassuring one. "I didn't," she said. "I knew the evidence was real. I knew the pattern was documented. I knew there were enough witnesses that it couldn't be ignored if the right person saw it." She paused. "But knowing something can work and knowing it will work are different things. I just decided the difference wasn't a reason not to try." Cole Prentice nodded slowly, turning his hat in his hands. Then he put it back on, straightened, and went out into the afternoon. And Evelyn watched him go and thought that sometimes justice looks like a young man putting his hat on and walking back into the world with his shoulders a little less bowed than they were before. The widow Marsh came to the ranch. She arrived on a Wednesday morning in a cart driven by her eldest son, a serious-faced boy of 17 who helped her down with careful hands and then stood by the horse while his mother walked to the front door. Evelyn opened it before she knocked. Margaret Marsh was perhaps 60, a thin woman with deep-set eyes and the dignified, weathered quality of someone who has kept her household running through things that would have stopped a lesser person entirely. She stood on the porch and looked at Evelyn and said, "My husband died believing we owed Harold Whitmore $2,000. He died thinking he'd failed us. The debt was fraudulent from the beginning, manufactured interest on a loan that had already been repaid." She stopped. Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I need you to understand what that means, not just the money. What it meant that he died thinking that." Evelyn was very still. "I understand," she said quietly. "I don't think most people do." Margaret Marsh looked past her for a moment, at something in the middle distance. He was a good man. He worked himself into the ground for 30 years, and at the end, Whitmore had him convinced he was a failure. That's not just fraud, that's... She stopped again. "It's theft," Evelyn said, "of the worst kind." Margaret looked at her. "Yes," she said, "that's the word." They sat together on the porch for an hour, Evelyn and Margaret Marsh, while Nathan dozed in his chair inside, and the Kansas morning moved around them. Margaret told her about her husband, not about the debt, but about the man, the way he'd laughed, the way he'd taught their son to read by lantern light, the way he'd kept going even when the going was cruel. She talked about him the way a person talks about someone they are still in the process of missing, which is to say, completely. Evelyn listened with her whole attention, which was what the moment asked for, and did not try to fix what couldn't be fixed, but simply sat with the weight of it alongside another person, which was sometimes the truest form of help available. When Margaret finally stood to go, she looked at Evelyn with those deep-set eyes and said, "I want you to know something. Before you came, before any of this, I had decided that what happened to us was simply the way things were, that powerful men did what they wanted and the rest of us absorbed it and there was no alternative." She paused. "I was wrong. I needed to see that I was wrong." "We all needed to see it," Evelyn said. The news about Thomas Ashcroft reached Redstone Crossing on the second week, carried in a brief official communication from the St. Louis authorities that Greer handed to Evelyn without preamble one morning in his temporary office. Thomas had been notified that his role in the fraudulent arrangement had been identified and that warrants were being prepared. He had, in the interval between notification and warrant, left St. Louis. His current location was unknown. Evelyn held the document and read it twice. She had thought about this moment, had known it was coming, had steeled herself against it in the particular way you steel yourself against things you have no power to change. Thomas was her brother. He was the only family she had left in the world. He was also the man who had traded her like a commodity to resolve a debt of his own making, without a word to her, without her knowledge, without what she was now certain was even a serious consideration of what it would cost her. He had looked at her and seen an asset, a number, a solution. She set the document on the table. "Are you all right?" Greer asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who asks because he should, and genuinely does not know how to respond to whatever the answer might be. "I will be," she said. "Eventually." She looked at the document once more. "He made his choice. He'll have to live with the consequences of it. I can't carry that for him anymore." It was the truest thing she had said in a long time, and saying it aloud made it more true, gave it a solidity that the silent version hadn't quite had. She left the document with Greer and walked outside into the morning air and stood on the boardwalk and breathed until the tight thing in her chest loosened enough to be manageable. Silas was waiting by the wagon. He had driven her in and was waiting as he had taken to doing, without comment, without pressing her for information she hadn't offered, simply present in that spare, reliable way that she had come to recognize as the deepest expression of his character. He looked at her face when she came out, and he didn't ask what had happened because he could see enough. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. He handed her up onto the bench and they drove back toward the ranch in the autumn morning, and halfway there he said without looking at her, "Nathan asked me last night if you were going to stay." She looked at the road ahead. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." A pause. "I should have told him it was your decision to make and no one else's." Another pause. "I'm telling you that now." She was quiet for a moment. The ranch came into view around the bend. The low house, the crooked fence, the barn with its repaired door that now hung straight, the water pump gleaming slightly in the morning light where she'd cleared the rust with oil and an hour of work 3 weeks ago. She had done that. She had fixed that. She had fixed a great many things about this place, and the place had fixed things in her that she hadn't known were broken. "I know it's my decision," she said. "Yes," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in silence, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more about it just then. The circuit judge arrived on a Thursday with 2 federal marshals and a clerk who took notes with frightening speed. The proceedings that followed were not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make legal proceedings. There were no sudden revelations, no theatrical moments of collapse. The evidence was what it had always been: documented, cross-referenced, witnessed, and overwhelming. Clara Whitmore testified for 2 hours in a voice that grew steadier as it went, reading passages from her husband's letters with the flat precision of someone who has had a long time to make her peace with what she knows. The families testified. Cole Prentice testified. Deputy Harlan testified to the patterns of intimidation he had observed over 8 years, including specific incidents he had documented privately in a ledger he produced from his coat pocket, a ledger no one had known about, kept in the particular hope of a man who believed that evidence was never wasted, even when the moment to use it hadn't arrived yet. When it was Evelyn's turn, she sat in the chair that had been placed before the judge's temporary bench, a table at the front of the meeting house, the largest room in Redstone Crossing, which was full, and she answered every question put to her with the same measured clarity she had brought to every conversation in the past weeks. She explained how she had found the letter. She explained what it had told her. She explained each step of the investigation in sequence, connected and documented, from her first conversation with Ruth Calloway to the letter sent to Topeka to the morning Greer had arrived on the stage. The judge was a man of 55 named Aldous Crane, who listened with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent their lives being the final authority in a room, and who therefore have learned not to perform interest, but to actually have it. When Evelyn finished, he looked at her over his reading glasses for a moment. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, "you arrived in this town approximately 2 months ago." "Yes, Your Honor, and in 2 months you assembled the case that has been presented to this court today." "With the help of a great many people," she said. "The help," he said dryly, "required a person to organize it." He made a note. "Thank you." She returned to her seat beside Silas, and his hand briefly covered hers on the bench between them. 1 moment, barely long enough to notice, and then gone. But she noticed. The verdict took 3 days to arrive and was, in the end, not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Harold Whitmore was found guilty of fraud, unlawful coercion, and criminal conspiracy across 11 separate counts. His associate in the county seat, the man whose name appeared in the earliest letters, who had been quietly arrested 2 days into the proceedings, received 4 counts. The judge declared every fraudulent contract null and void under federal authority. The land and property wrongfully seized from the families were to be returned or compensated. The grain harvest debt that had been calculated against Cole Prentice was voided entirely. The inflated debts of the widow Marsh's husband were formally struck from every legal record. The meeting house was very quiet when Judge Crane finished reading. Then Dale Henderson, who was sitting in the 3rd row with his wife, made a sound that was not quite a word, something that started as an exhale and arrived as something closer to a sob. And his wife put her arm around him, and that sound seemed to release something in the room, and the quiet broke, not into chaos, but into the low, moving sound of people who have been holding something very tightly for a very long time and have just been told they can let it go. Evelyn sat very still in the middle of it, and felt the sound move through her the way a long winter moves into spring. Not all at once, not cleanly, but genuinely. Whitmore was led out between the 2 federal marshals. He did not look at the room. He did not look at his wife. He did not look at Evelyn. He walked with his chin down and his hands bound in front of him, and the only thing she felt watching him go was a quiet, settling exhaustion. Not triumph, which had always seemed to her a feeling that belonged to people who'd had things easier, but the particular relief of a weight set down after a very long carrying. Ruth appeared at her elbow. "Come outside," Ruth said softly. "You need air." They went out onto the boardwalk, the same boardwalk, and stood in the afternoon light, the 2 of them, and Ruth put a hand on Evelyn's arm and didn't say anything for a moment. "He owned this town for 15 years. Ruth said finally, looking at the street. Every person who walked past his building felt it. That low-grade fear that you learn to live with because you don't see any alternative. She paused. And now? Now it's just a building, Evelyn said. Ruth looked at her. Yes, she said. Now it's just a building. Sheriff Beaumont came out behind them and stopped beside Evelyn on the boardwalk. He looked at the street, too, at the people coming out of the meeting house, at Dale Henderson with his arm around his wife, at Cole Prentice standing with his hat in his hands looking at the sky. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "When you came to my office, I told you it mattered that the sheriff had heard you." "You did," she said. "I meant it then." He paused. "I mean it more now." He turned to look at her directly, and there was no ambiguity in his face, no careful distance, just a man saying plainly what he thought. "This town owes you something it doesn't have a name for yet." Evelyn looked at the street, at the people, at the October light coming down long and gold across the front of the buildings, at Silas, who had come to stand a few feet away with Nathan beside him, the old man's hand on his son's arm, both of them looking at her with the quiet certainty of people who already know what they hope she will decide. "It doesn't owe me anything," she said. "I was angry, and I had evidence, and I had help." She paused. "That's all it ever takes." Beaumont looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, with the deep economical nod of a man who has nothing more to add, and went back inside. The afternoon held its light. Around her, Redstone Crossing breathed differently than it had the day before. Something had shifted in the air itself, the invisible weight of 15 years of accumulated fear beginning to lift like ground fog when the sun finally reaches it, slowly and then all at once. People on the boardwalk made eye contact with each other in ways they hadn't before. A woman laughed too loudly and then didn't apologize for it. A group of men talked in the open rather than in doorways. Small things, but small things were how the large things showed themselves, if you knew how to look. Evelyn knew how to look. She stood on the boardwalk of Redstone Crossing in the October afternoon and watched her work take shape in the world, and she felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to identify it clearly. Not safety exactly, not happiness in the simple, uncomplicated way, but something close to both and more durable than either. The feeling of a life that belonged to her, hers to keep, hers to build, hers to choose. She held on to that feeling carefully, the way you hold something you've been given that you know is irreplaceable. And she didn't let it go. The week after the verdict was the quietest Evelyn had known since arriving in Kansas. Not the quiet of emptiness. She had known that kind in the boarding house years in St. Louis, the particular silence of a life that is contracted to the size of a single room and stays there. This was different. This was the quiet of something completed, the way a long storm sounds after it has finally passed through and taken its weather elsewhere, leaving the air clean and the ground changed and everything still in the particular stillness of aftermath. She moved through the ranch with that quiet around her and inside her, doing the same work she had been doing for 2 months. The cooking, the cleaning, the accounts, the care of Nathan, but doing it now without the low, constant hum of the investigation running beneath everything. The weight of all those documents and witnesses and calculations that she had been carrying so steadily for so long that she hadn't fully understood how heavy they were until she was no longer carrying them. She slept differently, deeper. Without waking at 3 a.m. to lie in the dark and run through dates and names and document numbers, checking and rechecking the architecture of the case for weak points she might have missed. The first morning she woke naturally, with the sun already showing at the window. She lay still for several minutes in simple surprise at having arrived at the day without effort. Nathan noticed immediately. "You look like a person again," he said over breakfast, in the direct way that had become one of her favorite things about him. "I looked like a person before," she said. "You looked like a person carrying 40 other people," he corrected. "Now you just look like yourself." He considered his biscuit with the solemn attention he gave to food he was enjoying. "It's an improvement." She laughed, and the laugh felt different too, lighter, without the slight catch underneath that had been there for weeks. Silas said nothing over breakfast, which was not unusual, but he looked at her once, briefly, with those pale eyes, and what she saw in them was something she had learned over 2 months to read with reasonable accuracy. Satisfaction. Not the open, uncomplicated satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted, but the quieter, more careful version of a man who is watching something good happen and is trying not to interfere with it by reacting too loudly. She had come to understand, doing much the same with him. Greer came to the ranch on the 5th day to deliver his formal report before leaving for Dodge City. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he drank with evident appreciation. He had, over the course of his stay, become a reliable and uncomplaining consumer of Evelyn's cooking, which she took as the highest form of professional endorsement. And he went through the findings with the orderly thoroughness she had come to expect from him. 11 families across 3 counties had been directly affected by Whitmore's fraudulent contracts. 7 of those families would receive property restitution. The remaining 4, whose property had already been resold, would receive financial compensation assessed against Whitmore's seized assets. The labor agreements, including Cole Prentice's, were voided in their entirety. The inflated debt records, including those carried under the name of Margaret Marsh's late husband, were struck from every legal record in the territory. The associate in the county seat, a man named Aldrich, who had provided legal cover for Whitmore's most complex schemes, had entered a guilty plea in exchange for cooperation with the federal investigation. His testimony had extended the scope of the case beyond the 3-county territory, reaching into the operations of 2 other fraudulent land agents operating by similar methods in neighboring regions. That investigation was now ongoing in the hands of Greer's office and 2 additional federal agents who had been assigned to the expanded case. Your documentation, Greer said, setting down his coffee, will be cited as the foundational evidence for the broader investigation. The methods you use to cross-reference documents and identify the pattern will be, he paused, choosing his words with the precision that was simply his nature, instructive. To people with considerably more official authority than you have. Evelyn looked at him. Is that a compliment, Agent Greer? It is a factual statement, he said, and then, with the faintest adjustment at the corner of his mouth that was the closest he had come to a smile in 3 weeks, which in my experience are more durable than compliments. She walked him to his horse when he left, and he shook her hand at the gate with the same brief, firm grip as the first time, and he looked at her with those cataloging eyes and said, "If you ever find yourself in need of a different kind of work, Miss Ashcroft, the kind that involves documents and patterns and a willingness to ask questions that make powerful people uncomfortable, there are offices that would be interested in your particular abilities." She looked at him steadily. "I'll remember that." He nodded once, mounted, and rode down the east road toward town, and she watched him go with the particular feeling of watching a chapter close, not unhappily but completely, the way you close a book you've finished and hold it for a moment before setting it down. Ruth Calloway came to supper that Saturday, the first social visit the ranch had hosted in what Silas admitted, with some difficulty, was probably years. Evelyn made a proper meal: roasted chicken, potatoes, a dried apple pie she'd been planning since she'd found the last of the season's apples at the Mercantile, and set the table with the good cloth she'd discovered folded at the bottom of the cedar chest, slightly yellowed but clean, and the 4 of them sat down together in the warm kitchen with the lamps lit against the early autumn dark. Nathan told 3 stories from his ranching years that Evelyn had heard before and laughed at again because the telling was always slightly different, the details shifting and embellishing themselves the way good stories do with repetition. Ruth, who turned out to have a dry and formidable wit that only emerged in the right company, matched him story for story, and somewhere between the chicken and the pie the conversation moved from the past to the present and then, carefully, to the future. The Hendersons' plans to expand their grain operation, now that the fraudulent contract was lifted, Cole Prentice's announcement that he intended to file on a homestead claim southwest of town, the question of what would happen to Whitmore's properties once the federal asset proceedings were complete. "The warehouse will go to auction," Ruth said. "Half the town wants to buy it just for the satisfaction of owning something that used to be his." "What would you do with it?" Evelyn asked. "Storage, probably. Or convert it. That's a large space. Big enough for a proper meeting hall." Ruth looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "Redstone Crossing has needed a meeting hall for 20 years. We've been using the church and the meeting house, and both of them belong to other purposes." "A community building," Nathan said approvingly. "Good idea. Give people a reason to be in the same room when nothing's going wrong." "What a concept," Silas said, with the quiet, almost imperceptible dryness that passed for humor in him. and Ruth laughed and Evelyn smiled at the table because there was something happening here at this kitchen table that she wanted to note and remember. The ordinary, irreplaceable warmth of people who have come through something hard together and arrived on the other side still intact, still willing to sit down and pass the bread and laugh at something that doesn't require explanation. After Ruth left, Nathan went to bed early with the pleased, drowsy satisfaction of a man who has been well-fed and well-entertained. Evelyn washed the dishes at the basin and Silas dried them, which he had taken to doing sometime in the last few weeks without discussion, and the kitchen was warm and quiet around them. "Good evening," Silas said after a while. "Yes," she agreed. "Nathan's going to be talking about that apple pie for a week. He already asked me twice during supper if there was more." A pause. The dish he was drying was already dry. He kept drying it. "Ruth thinks highly of you," he said. "She told me last week that you were the most capable person she'd met in 30 years of running the post office. She said it like she expected me to be surprised." Evelyn looked at the basin. "Were you?" The pause was longer this time. "No," he said. "I stopped being surprised by what you're capable of about 3 weeks after you got here." He set the dish down on the shelf, not looking at her. "I was surprised I hadn't said so." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the shelf, at the stacked dishes, with the expression of a man who has said something true and is waiting to find out what it costs him. "Silas," she said. He turned. She looked at him, at the face that had seemed so close to her on the first day, that she had slowly learned to read like a difficult landscape, ridge by ridge, until the terrain was familiar enough to move through without getting lost. She looked at him and thought about what it meant to have built something with a person. Not just fixed it, not just maintained it, but actually built it, from something broken into something that could hold weight. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you didn't say and did anyway." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in those pale eyes. Something she recognized now as the emotion he carried closest to the surface but showed least willingly. "Evelyn," he said, and her name in his voice had a different quality than it did from anyone else. Careful, like something held with attention. "I need to ask you something, and I need to ask it plainly, because I don't know how to do it any other way." "Ask it plainly, then," she said. He turned fully toward her and looked at her with the direct, steady gaze of a man who has spent a great deal of time deciding what he wants and is now done deciding. "Stay," he said, "not as a housekeeper, not because you don't have other options. I know you do. You always have. Stay because this is where you want to be." He paused. "I want to build something here, a real thing, a lasting thing, and I don't want to build it alone. I don't want—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't know how empty this place was until you filled it. I don't want to find out what it goes back to without you." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn stood in the warm light of the lamp with the dish basin in front of her. In the October dark outside the window, she had cleaned herself on her second day at the ranch, and she looked at Silas Boone, who was not warm, who was not easy, who had difficulty with words and expressed what mattered most through what he did rather than what he said, who had sat beside his father and listened to him talk for the first time in months because a woman had made supper and set it on the table, who had covered her hand briefly in a courtroom and never mentioned it again, who had driven her to town and waited without being asked and carried her back when she needed carrying. She looked at him and felt the full, clear weight of the choice in front of her. It was, she understood, the first real choice she had made in a very long time. Not a choice made from desperation or from the narrowing of options or from someone else's debt or design. A choice made from freedom, from knowledge, from the particular kind of certainty that can only arrive after you have survived enough to trust your own judgment. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, you'll stay?" "Yes, I'll stay." She paused. "Ask me properly, Silas. You said you'd ask it plainly." He looked at her for a moment, and then something happened to his face that she had never quite seen before, something that started in his eyes and moved slowly outward, something that might on a different man have been the prelude to a smile. But on Silas Boone was something quieter and more serious and more completely real. He crossed the kitchen floor in 2 steps and took both her hands in his. His hands were rough and warm and certain. And he looked at her directly, the way he looked at everything that mattered, without deflection. "Evelyn Ashcroft," he said, "will you stay at this ranch and build a life with me? She held his gaze. "I will," she said. They married in November in the Redstone Crossing meeting house, on a morning when the Kansas sky had gone the particular deep blue of late autumn, and the cottonwoods along the East Road had shed most of their leaves, and the air was cold and clean and honest. Ruth Calloway stood up with Evelyn. Deputy Harlan, who had filed the paperwork himself with what Evelyn recognized as the quiet satisfaction of a man making a long overdue correction, attended with his wife. The Hendersons came, and the widow Marsh and Cole Prentice in a new jacket that still had the fold lines in it. Nathan Boone sat in the front row in his good shirt and wept without embarrassment, which he would later describe as entirely appropriate and would mention at least 4 times in the weeks that followed. The ceremony was simple and short. What took longer was the meal afterward, which Evelyn had prepared in advance, and which covered the meeting house tables with more food than the assembled company could reasonably eat, which they attempted anyway with great enthusiasm. The afternoon went long into the evening, and the conversation went everywhere, and Nathan told a story about Silas as a boy, that Silas bore with visible effort, and that the room enjoyed enormously. And at some point Ruth stood up and said something about Evelyn that made Evelyn look at the table and press her lips together against the specific emotion of being known accurately by someone who has paid you the full attention of their regard. When it was finally over, and the last guests had gone, and Nathan had been walked home by Dale Henderson, who lived near enough to make it practical, Silas and Evelyn stood in the cleared meeting house in the quiet of the emptied room and looked at each other in the lamplight. "Well," Silas said. "Well," she agreed. He looked around the room, at the chairs set back in their rows, at the tables folded against the wall, at the particular quality of a space that has just held a great deal of living and is now resting. "You fed 40 people today," he said. 43, she said. "I counted." "Of course you did." The corner of his mouth moved. "Are you tired?" "Profoundly," she said, and meant it, and smiled because she did not mind it at all. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked out of the meeting house into the November night, into the cold Kansas air and the enormous Kansas sky with its freight of stars, and the East Road lay ahead of them pale in the darkness, 4 miles back to the ranch. The winter that followed was the hardest the territory had seen in several years, with storms that came down from the north in long white curtains and kept the range work to a minimum and the ranch house to itself for days at a time. Evelyn had grown up in cities and had never known winter like this. The absolute crystalline silence of a snowbound morning. The way the cold had a texture and a weight. The way the house became its own entire world when the distance to anywhere else was measured in degrees of danger rather than miles. She found she loved it. She loved the enforced intimacy of the 3 of them, she and Silas and Nathan, gathered in the kitchen where the stove made everything warm and yellow while the world outside went white. She loved the long evenings with the lamp on the table and Nathan's voice telling stories she had heard enough times now to know by heart, and Silas's quiet on the other side of the table that was no longer a closed quiet, but an open one, a quiet that made room. She loved waking in the dark to the sound of wind and knowing exactly where she was and that it was right. She kept her journal. She wrote in it differently now, not the urgent investigative notes of the fall, but slower observations, the kind that don't require any action, but simply want to be recorded. She wrote about the way Nathan had begun to speak about his wife in the present tense sometimes, not confused, but as though the distance between the living and the remembered had grown smaller and less painful. She wrote about the fence line she and Silas had ridden together in December to check for storm damage, the 2 of them on horseback in the winter light, talking about the spring and what it could be. She wrote, "I came here with $11 and a thimble and a recipe book. I came here because I had no better idea, and I was too stubborn to go back. I did not expect this. I am learning that the things you do not expect are often the things that turn out to matter most." Spring arrived with the specific, extravagant relief of a Kansas spring. Sudden and total, converting the white world back to brown and then to green in what felt like a single week. The cattle came back from the southern range in good condition. The fence lines held. The new calves came early and strong. Silas spent long days on the range and came back in the evenings with the particular aliveness of a man whose work is going well, which in him expressed itself as slightly more words at supper and a willingness to stay at the kitchen table longer before going to check the books. Nathan, buoyed by the warmth and the green and the general improvement in the quality of his days, decided in April that he wanted a garden. Not a practical kitchen garden, those were Evelyn's domain and had been since October, but a proper flower garden along the south side of the house, the way Margaret had kept when she was alive. "I don't know if I remember how," he said, looking at the ground. "Then we'll figure it out together," Evelyn said. They spent 3 Saturdays turning soil and debating the merits of various arrangements with the particular cheerful seriousness of people engaged in an undertaking that matters to them without mattering to anyone else in the world. Silas watched from the porch on the 3rd Saturday with his coffee and the expression of a man seeing something he had given up hoping for, and when Evelyn looked up and caught him watching, he didn't look away. She looked back at the dirt. She was smiling. Ruth came out every 2 weeks for Sunday supper, a tradition that had established itself without anyone formally proposing it, and that had accordingly the permanence of things that exist because they are simply right. She and Nathan had developed a friendship of their own, 2 old people with long memories and sharp minds, and the shared history of Redstone Crossing's decades, who could keep each other talking for hours without effort. Evelyn watched them across the supper table and thought about the strange paths by which people find their way to one another. In May, a letter arrived. It was from Clara Whitmore. Harold Whitmore's trial at the federal circuit level had concluded the previous week, she wrote, with a sentence of 7 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. She herself had petitioned the court and been granted legal separation, and with a portion of the assets that remained after federal restitution. Not much, but enough. She was leaving Kansas. She was going to her sister in Ohio. She wanted Evelyn to know that what she had done in carrying those letters to Greer's meeting had been, as she put it, the first decision I have made entirely for myself in 15 years. I am grateful to you for making the room for it. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she wrote back, a single page, careful and warm, and told Clara Whitmore that the decision had been entirely her own, that courage doesn't require an invitation, only a moment, and that she hoped Ohio would be everything it needed to be. She sealed the envelope and brought it to town herself, and handed it to Ruth across the post office counter, and Ruth held it for a moment and looked at the address. "Ohio," Ruth said. "Ohio," Evelyn confirmed. Ruth said it with the outgoing mail. "Good," she said simply. On a Tuesday evening in late May, with the windows open to the warm Kansas air and the sound of cattle in the distance, and the last light going long and gold across the kitchen floor, Silas came in from the range and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the kitchen table where Evelyn was writing in her journal, and he watched her write for a moment with that open, quiet attention he had learned to let her see. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He had something in his hand, a small thing, which he set on the table between them. It was a ring, plain gold, without ornament. He had clearly been carrying it for some time. "This was my mother's," he said. "Nathan wanted you to have it. He asked me to give it to you when the time felt right." He paused. "I've been trying to determine when that was for about 3 months." She looked at the ring on the table. She looked at him. "Why now?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to everything that mattered. "Because this morning I rode the south fence line, and the grass is coming in strong, and the cattle are in good condition, and the accounts are the best they've been in 4 years." He paused. "And because I came home, and you were at that table, and Nathan was in the garden, and the kitchen smelled like supper, and I understood very clearly that this is what a life is supposed to feel like." He met her eyes. I didn't want to wait any longer to say it. Evelyn looked at the ring. She looked at the man across the table. Spare and angular and plain-speaking, difficult and decent, and more capable of love than he had known how to show, until someone had stayed long enough to make it safe. She thought about $11 and a thimble, and an East Road 4 miles out of a town that had watched her arrive with nothing. She reached across the table and picked up the ring and put it on her finger, where it fit as though it had been made for her, which it had not been, but perhaps had been intended for, in whatever way things work themselves toward their proper placement, if given enough time and enough stubbornness to insist on arrival. "Tell Nathan thank you," she said. "Tell him yourself," Silas said. "He's been waiting at his window for the last hour." She laughed, the full, unguarded laugh that had come back to her this year like a thing she'd forgotten she knew how to do. And Silas looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of joy, which was quieter and more durable than most people's, and entirely his own. Outside, the Kansas evening was doing what Kansas evenings did, going vast and rose-colored and enormous in every direction. The sky big enough to contain everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. The land flat and honest beneath it, the ranch sitting solid in the middle of it all, its fence line straight, its windows lit. Nathan Boone appeared at the kitchen door, entirely failing to look like a man who had not been waiting and watching. "Well?" he said. Evelyn held up her hand. Nathan made a sound that was equal parts triumph and sentiment, and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who is communicating with no one in particular, but feels strongly nonetheless. Then he came to the table and sat down in his chair, the same one he'd sat in that first night when Evelyn had set a bowl of beans in front of a man who had barely spoken in months. And he looked at his son and his daughter-in-law and the ring on her finger and the supper on the stove and the open windows letting in the May evening, and he said, with the simple satisfaction of someone who has lived long enough to see things come right, "Good. Now, can we eat? I've been smelling that supper for an hour." They ate together in the warm kitchen while the stars came out over Kansas and the ranch settled around them in the dark, and the East Road lay quiet between the Boone Ranch and the town that had once watched Evelyn Ashcroft arrive with nothing. She had arrived with nothing. She had built everything. And the life she lived now, this ordinary, irreplaceable, completely chosen life, was entirely, irrevocably her own.